Whoa! It's kind of an
until afterwards.
It's kind of an informal affair. We've been doing this since the summer in August, I guess. On Tuesdays, generally the last Tuesday of the month. Past topics have included freedom of information, our policy towards China, various things. And they've been very lively discussions. We've kept it informal, so feel free to move around, order food or drink. And if you want to know what's coming up, you can get on easily onto the mailing list and be informed regularly of what we're doing. Tonight we're going to try and wrap up the discussion by 9:15, 9:30, but you're welcome to stay afterwards and keep on talking and keep on eating and drinking. I am David Cayley. I'm a member of the board of the Energy Probe Research Foundation, which is how I got roped into being the moderator. On my left is Dr. Ari Zaretsky, who is the chief of psychiatry at Sunnybrook Hospital and the vice president for education, and someone whom the media reasonably often resort to on the subject of vaccines and autism. Yes, is that true?
No.
Not often?
No.
Occasionally, you've been consulted, or not?
I responded to this because of Larry's article in the National Post and felt that I needed to take a stand.
All right.
As a physician.
And on my right is Larry Solomon, who's my colleague at the Energy Probe Research Foundation, who's a columnist also in the National Post, and who, do you edit a website called Vaccine Fact Check, which is sadly moribund at the moment, but has been active in the last year, and which provides information about vaccines. Our subject, I think is what it says on the poster, is the Wakefield vaccine scandal. And I think it's a scandal, whatever view you take of it, probably. And I think probably everyone in this room knows what it refers to, but I'll just say briefly that Wakefield was one of 13 authors of a paper that was published in The Lancet in 1998 that investigated but did not claim to have proved, in fact explicitly said it had not proved, a link between autism and the measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine, and also bowel disease, which they also investigated. This article was described by the editor of The Lancet later as having been the starting pistol, I think he said, for this whole discussion, which is now probably involved millions, on autism and vaccine. 12 years after it was published in 2010, The Lancet withdrew the article. So if you want to read it now, it's got, what does it say on it? Retracted. So that's the current state of that. Since the controversy started, there have been numerous studies done on the subject, none of which have really claimed to show a decisive link between vaccines and autism, but the discussion has continued, and we're going to continue it here. I'm going to call first on Larry Solomon, who, despite the debunking of this study, and whether it's sound or not, it certainly has been debunked. You don't believe that it has been disproved that there's a link between autism and vaccines. So why don't you start off for, say, 5 or 10 minutes?
Thank you, David.
And then Ari will respond.
And thank everyone for coming, and especially you, Ari, for taking a stand and making this evening possible. Ari and I agree that there's a great deal of misinformation out there about the safety of vaccines. I hope our discussion tonight helps clear away at least some of that misinformation. Ari and I would agree on many things, including that vaccines have the potential to do great good. In terms of the specific debate tonight, we agree that the vaccine that the Wakefield vaccine scandal was a watershed event that changed the public debate on vaccines. Where we disagree is on where the scandal is, what the scandal is. The Wakefield study was torn to shreds by the General Medical Council. That's the UK government's official regulator over the medical profession. The discrediting of this study started in 2004 and lasted until 2010 with a mountain of submissions lambasting the authors. This was the most extensive hearing by far in the history of that regulator. The government regulator found that the Wakefield study had been conducted improperly and unethically and detailed dozens of egregious transgressions. The regulator then stripped Dr. Andrew Wakefield and one other prominent author of their right to practice medicine, citing serious professional misconduct. That was 2010. Soon after, Wakefield threw in the towel. After fighting for more than a decade, he didn't have the funds to carry on. But his co-author, who lost his license on essentially the same grounds as Wakefield, appealed the government regulator's ruling to the British High Court. This is the highest court in the UK next to the Supreme Court. The co-author was actually better known at the time than Wakefield. The co-author's name is Dr. John Walker Smith, a legendary figure in the field. He is known as the father of pediatric gastroenterology. He was then 73 years old and retired, so he didn't need his license to practice medicine. He just wanted his reputation back. In the appeal, the High Court examined all the evidence before it, and it threw out every last charge of misconduct, every last charge. It didn't just throw out the charges, it made clear that it considered the charges to have been an abomination. The court called the government's reasoning odd, untenable, unsustainable, and on any view, inadequate. These are all direct quotes from the court's decision, which I have here, and I have made copies for anyone in the audience who would like to see it and take a copy home. The court went further. It expressed amazement at the, quote, serious weakness in the government's reasoning. It said the government regulator failed in its duty to do justice, ignoring awkward facts that didn't support its case and making a finding based on distorted summary of Professor Walker Smith's evidence. The government's finding, this is more quotes, factually unsound. But the court went even further. It not only told the government regulator to reinstate Walker Smith's license to practice medicine, it told the government regulator to clean up its own act so that such an abomination could never happen again. Walker Smith's license was reinstated, and the Wakefield study was, in effect, totally exonerated. The regulator was chastened, and the regulator reformed. This was a total victory for Walker Smith and a total victory for the study. It was a total repudiation for the regulator. Now, let me briefly describe the essence of the charges against the 13 authors. The charges were Kafkaesque. In the UK as elsewhere, studies must be conducted ethically, based on criteria specific to each study. The Wakefield study was going to be followed up with a second study, which would have used some of the results from the first study. Let's call these two studies Study A and Study B. The researchers obtained separate ethics approval for each of the two studies. The researchers then completed Study A. This is the infamous study that we're discussing tonight. The researchers never undertook Study B. But to the astonishment of the researchers, the government regulator claimed they hadn't been working on Study A at all. The government regulator claimed they were working on Study B, which required different ethical guidelines. On that bizarre basis, they were judged guilty of serious professional misconduct. As the High Court stated, this was an absurd position for the government regulator to take, since Wakefield and the other researchers acted in a manner fully consistent with the plan for Study A. Their research would have made no sense if they were conducting Study B. Almost no one knows about the British High Court's repudiation of the government regulator. If you do a Google News search on the British High Court decision, you'll find just a handful of articles, almost none of them in the mainstream media. If you do a Google News search of Wakefield along with terms such as debunked or fraudulent or retracted, you'll find 6,000 in the news media and over 400,000 articles if you include blogs and other sites. So why didn't the mainstream media report this? I can tell you why from personal experience. I wrote about the British High Court decision for my column in the National Post, but the management at the Post, not the editor, the management, pulled it at the last minute and also stopped me from writing other vaccine columns. In my 20 years as a columnist at the Post, vaccines have been the only taboo subject. I used to be a columnist at the Globe and Mail, and at times I continued to write for the Globe. But it won't accept any questioning of vaccines. Huffington Post will take anything I submit, but not on vaccines. I'm a contributor to The Hill, a US media site that specializes in politics. It won't take my vaccine pieces, even if it involves a hearing before the US Congress, before The Hill. The media has a blackout on stories that question vaccines. It is terrified to run anything hinting that vaccines may not always be perfect. As a result of this taboo, the general public and the medical profession itself has been kept in the dark about the Wakefield study and almost any other study that challenges the conventional wisdom. Here's some information that will be news to you. Wakefield has support from top scientists who believe that the safety of vaccines is in question, including their potential role in autism. I mentioned that John Walker-Smith supports Wakefield. He's not alone. Peter Fletcher, the former chief scientific officer at the UK's Department of Health, also supports Wakefield. He is the very person who determined for the UK government whether vaccines are safe. There's Bernadine Healy. She had a task force for under 3 US presidents, 3 White House task force, and she also was the president of the National Institutes of Health. She was also the president of the American Red Cross. The National Institutes of Health is the largest funder of health in the world. She has stated several times that the research that's needed to be done is not being done to establish that vaccines don't cause autism. Then there's Professor Walter Spitzer of McGill University and McMaster and Stanford. He testified that vaccines probably do cause harm. They probably do cause autism, probably with a high probability that they cause autism. Spitzer is considered Canada's Dean of Epidemiology, and he's a founder, one of 3 founders of evidence-based medicine. The list of those who think vaccines could be causing autism is long. The list of those who think vaccines could be causing other problems is even longer. The science is not settled on vaccines.
Thank you, Larry. Harry, over to you.
Thank you, and thanks everyone for coming out this evening. I hope that we can have a thoughtful discussion on this issue, and it is obviously very emotionally laden for many individuals.
Okay, can we move it?
Sure.
How about that?
Can people hear me?
Can you still
I'll have to use my booming voice here.
can you still see your stuff?
Yeah. So, as a psychiatrist, I was kind of reflecting on.
It is working. It's just. Okay.
Can you hear me?
This and move it.
Yeah?
And then you have
Okay.
this to the side.
Okay.
Will that work?
Yeah. So as a psychiatrist, we often think about our motives, and I was thinking about my motives in coming down this evening to debate with Larry, and I thought to myself, if this was a debate about the Holocaust and whether it happened or not, would I participate in such a debate? And the answer is no, I would not. If this was a debate about whether psychiatry was real or not, and by the way, there is now at OISE a special chair in anti-psychiatry at the University of Toronto, would I debate with them about whether mental illness is real or not? And the answer is no. I would not actually lower myself to debate those kinds of issues. But I will actually have a debate about the issue of vaccines and autism, because I don't think it's exactly the same thing, although there are elements of the two, I think, in terms of playing on people's paranoia and misinformation and a general distrust of big government, for example. And I'm here as an educator because I believe that it is important to educate the public about facts and ensure that they make decisions that are based on facts. You should know that 50% or so of the Canadian public have poor health literacy. That is, that they don't understand basic facts about health, epidemiology, and they can't make informed decisions. And that's why we discharge patients from hospitals and they don't get better, because they don't understand the nature of illness, they don't take their medications, and they relapse. So health literacy is important.
It's important also to say, you know, if 50% of people aren't health literate, then, you know, who says who, and what does it mean to be health literate? You know,
So I'm going to...
here's your prescription, go home, take your medicines. A patient who says, actually, you know, I don't think that's going to really help me, is that then the literate patient?
Not at all. In fact, it's very important for them to understand the nature of their illness, what an illness is, what the benefits and risks of taking a medication are, how the medication works, those kinds of things, which for many people is very difficult. So health literacy is important, but I'm also here as a psychiatrist because autism is a devastating condition. And as the father of a 20-year-old son who has autism, severe autism, who's nonverbal, I know firsthand how serious this illness can be. And I also understand a little bit about the nature of human beings trying to attribute causality to something that they experience in a temporal kind of relationship with. So autism is diagnosed typically at around 1 year of age or a little bit later. My son was diagnosed at 14 months, and we started to notice things at about 13 months. People get the MMR vaccine at 12 months. That's the biology of autism, is that it is diagnosed when people are starting to acquire language, and they don't acquire language generally. So it is understandable that parents will try to attribute their child's condition, like autism, to something that's happening in the environment, like vaccinations, like the MMR vaccine. And I think it's really important to understand the science behind vaccinations. I'm not an expert on vaccinations. I'm a psychiatrist. I'm not a pediatrician. But I have consulted with colleagues who are pediatricians, and I can tell you that it goes without saying that immunizations have extended the life of human beings on our planet. They have prevented serious illnesses. Now, what about the relationship with autism? You know, my colleague talks in Talmudic detail about the problems with the Wakefield study. I am not as well versed in all the details, but I can tell you as a physician who has read the literature, this is my understanding that Wakefield conducted a study in which there was data that was falsified to some extent, and it was retracted. It was retracted for a reason. And he may talk about the big pharmaceutical industrial complex and the tyranny of big government. It was retracted because of poor quality experimental methodology. And more importantly, let's go back to then MMR and the safety of MMR vaccinations and autism. There are many, many studies that have tried to investigate this, many epidemiologists. Larry can handpick a few, as he tends to do when he wants to make arguments like about climate change. He'll handpick a few individuals that will contradict the general consensus, the scientific general consensus. And I'm sorry that we're talking about many, many studies conducted that have looked at this relationship and have not found a relationship. Okay? Now again, temporal relationship does not mean that there's causality. There's more to it than that, right? You have to also see the strength of the relationship. You have to see all kinds of things before you come to a conclusion that MMR vaccines, which are given at 12 months generally, are leading to autism, which is a condition that is diagnosed later on. And I can tell you that again, it is important to recognize that in Canada we have a process to ensure the safety of vaccines, pre-licensure review and approval, good manufacturing procedures, lot assessment before release, post-marketing surveillance, causality assessment review, process for action if the vaccine performance is an issue, vaccine recommendations based on epidemiology, vaccine effectiveness and efficacy, and international collaboration. And again, autism has taken off in the last 15 years. Why is that? Is it the MMR vaccine, or is it possibly the way we diagnose autism? There is a change in the last 15 years in terms of how we diagnose autism. Many of you are familiar with the fact that DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, is used as the kind of the Bible of psychiatrists in terms of diagnosis, with all its flaws, changed the criteria so that what we see now is an increase in the diagnosis of autism and an increase in the diagnosis of autism and a decrease in the diagnosis of other developmental disabilities, so that you can see that kind of relationship. And if MMR vaccines were the cause of autism, then why would we see this takeoff in the last 15 years? MMR vaccines have been around for a long, long time, much longer than 15 years. It doesn't make any sense. All of this is misinformation, and again, it plays on a lack of health literacy. So again, I would say that there are certain basic facts. The Holocaust happened, 9/11 was not an inside job, and vaccines are generally safe, especially when it comes to autism.
Ari,
Is it your view that the entire increase in autism, which is now, I think people say 1 in 42 boys will be diagnosed with something on the autism spectrum, and something like 1 in 70-something girls, that is entirely explained by a change in diagnostic, shifting of diagnostic categories?
As the parent of a child with autism, I personally don't think that can explain it itself. I do believe it's a gene-environment interaction. It's important to recognize and respect the genetics. If my son had an identical twin who had, and he has autism, if he had an identical twin, the likelihood that identical twin would have autism is 80%. Okay, it's one of the highest genetic kind of risks for a condition when you talk about psychiatry or neuropsychiatry. If he has a fraternal twin, the risk goes down to about 30%. Now, you can't say that the environment is so different. If they all get vaccinations, why would it be that you see this difference? Genetics counts for something here. I believe it's a gene-environment interaction, just like schizophrenia and other conditions. I don't have a simple answer. I think that we have to investigate what's happening in the environment and try to understand it, but to blame it on vaccines is just not based on fact. We have to use a scientific approach to make decisions. There are serious implications when people don't vaccinate their children with MMR vaccine. You have outbreaks of things like measles, which can cause brain damage for children.
Okay. Can we wait with the commentary till we open the floor?
Some people have measles and mumps and they're okay. Some people have measles and mumps and they have serious outcomes like sterility. They have brain infections that cause damage. They have cerebral palsy. Those kinds of things are increased in terms of risk when you don't vaccinate. And when you don't have herd immunity, which is required to protect the population, then you have serious outcomes. So, to say that you can get by without vaccinating and that this is a benign thing and that, there's danger in terms of vaccinations, I think, again, is based on a lack of information and facts.
Thank you.
Now, I should also say that there are reasons to be concerned about
Vaccinating everyone for every single thing.
For example, right now in my hospital, there is a vaccine or mask policy for influenza, okay? And it's based on a kind of calculus that we're probably better off in terms of vaccinating for influenza, in terms of protecting vulnerable people, like elderly people who are immunocompromised, than not vaccinating. But the truth of the fact, the truth of the matter is that many times, many years, that vaccine isn't that effective. No. And so it's important to be honest about the limitations of vaccines and making decisions based on, the truth, based on what we know. So it's important not to kind of say that, everyone should be vaccinated all the time, the vaccines are perfect, that they work perfectly. Vaccines are associated with seizures sometimes. 1 in 100,000 people who get vaccinated, a baby who gets vaccinated will have a seizure, a febrile seizure. That's not a trivial thing. But I think that if you look at the entire picture and you look at the epidemiology and you look at the research and the science, I think that vaccines like MMR do not appear to cause autism, and they do a lot of good, and much more good than bad.
Thank you. Larry, do you want to take up this question of the increase in autism rates?
Yes, because one of the reasons that scientists have looked at MMR is because there has been a coincidence of the rise in autism with the introduction of the MMR vaccine. Walter Spitzer, he's the person I referred to before as Canada's Dean of Epidemiology. That's one of the reasons that he thinks it's likely that vaccines are a risk factor in autism. I'd also like to comment on Ari's view that the fact that the Lancet retracted it is somehow damning. The Lancet published it in 1998. Almost immediately, there was a huge controversy. The Lancet's publisher stayed with the study throughout the controversy, right through to 2010. And only when the government's regulator, removed the licenses from the two lead investigators of the study, only then did the Lancet feel that it had no choice but to retract the study. It stayed with it through thick and thin for 12 years. I think that's quite a record. I also don't think it's quite right to say that I'm cherry picking scientists who hold this view. If I am cherry picking, it's the scientists at the very top of their field. This is the president of the National Institutes of Health. It's the father of pediatric gastroenterology. It's the dean of epidemiology. But also, I correspond with literally hundreds of physicians in the field, researchers and physicians in the field who have these kinds of concerns. It's a very long list, but people aren't aware of that list because it's very hard to go public. When the General Medical Council, when it stripped John Walker Smith of his right to practice medicine, it did so very reluctantly. They said that he was such an icon in the field. They really felt it was awful that they had to do it, but they said they had to do it to create an example because they didn't want other physicians to challenge the orthodoxy in vaccines. So they made him a sacrificial lamb. They made Andrew Wakefield a sacrificial lamb, and it worked because you will find very few physicians now, very few researchers daring to publicly express dissent because they know that they may be stripped of their right to practice medicine if they do.
So, can I respond to that? Of course. I think that, again, we should recognize that Wakefield's study hasn't been replicated. So, again, we make decisions based on multiple studies being done, pointing in a certain direction. This study was flawed, poorly executed, and my understanding is that, in fact, the data was not even acquired in an accurate way. So that's essentially what we're talking. There's the allegation that the data was falsified. Okay. Now this was not replicated even if it was accurate, it wasn't replicated. You have to have many studies before you come to a conclusion that there's a causal relationship. There's a more parsimonious way to understand the fact that autism has increased over the last decade and a half, and that a large component of it is the spectrum way of diagnosing things. So we use a spectrum diagnosis so that people are along a spectrum, and so that you have much milder conditions being looped into this autism concept. Now, in my view, that's a problem, because if everyone's along a spectrum, then you lose the true meaning of the diagnosis. My son has autism. He doesn't have Asperger's. He's nonverbal. That's a serious condition. And if we can have people who are also lumped into that autism spectrum that are just a little bit odd, don't make eye contact, etc., then you lose the meaning of the diagnosis. And then you can come to the conclusion that autism has taken off. So again, we have to be careful about the science, and we have to be careful about the whole process of doing research in this area.
I agree we have to be careful with the science. I should point out the High Court threw out the allegations that the data was collected improperly. And also the General Medical Council, it had the option of appealing, but it did not appeal. It knew that an appeal would fail. So it accepted the reprimand from the High Court, and it reformed itself. The other question is where should the onus be? Wakefield, Walker Smith, all the experts that I've cited, none of them say autism is caused by vaccines. They all say we need more research because there is no way to establish, based on what we know so far, that vaccines are not implicated in autism. And where the medical profession has failed is in refusing to do the research necessary to establish whether vaccines are or are not implicated. All that the so-called vaccine skeptics are asking for is research.
I'm happy to support the idea of research. If you don't vaccinate your children with MMR, you can look at whether there's a higher or lower incidence of autism in those children. And I think it will be very interesting to find out in the future if there's a difference. One would assume that there would be a causal relationship, that you would see a lower incidence of autism in those that haven't been vaccinated. And at this point in time, there is no evidence to suggest that at all.
So Ari, I would like to commend you for endorsing the idea of that study. There has never been a study comparing the health of vaccinated children with the health of unvaccinated children. You would think there's. I'm aware of that study. There has never been a large-scale study. The one study that you're referring to actually was suppressed, and it was very hard to get it published, despite the credentials of the people doing it. It was actually retracted after the publisher agreed to publish it. The publisher retracted it because of pressure from the medical establishment. But the study, Ari, that you suggested would be determinative is exactly what the vaccine skeptic community is asking for. They're saying, give us a study that compares the health of vaccinated children to the health of unvaccinated children. That would satisfy everyone. If that study showed that vaccines improve the health, or even if it doesn't harm the health, that would satisfy everyone. It would end the controversy. But the medical establishment refuses to perform that study. And that is something that's inexplicable. And if you would like to join the cause, demand that this study be performed, you'd be doing a great service.
So again, I think that it's important to be empathic for why it hasn't been promulgated. If you actually ask everyone to not vaccinate their children, right, then what happens to herd immunity, right? So that's the problem that I think on the other side, when
the control group is in Hollywood.
Yeah, that's right. The control group could be in Hollywood, and we could study them to see
100%.
if in fact what Larry's saying is true. But my hope would be that in fact people would actually listen to the facts, because if they found that there was no lower incidence of autism, right, one would assume that the people that haven't been vaccinated would have a lower incidence of autism. If you don't find that, will people change their mind about this relationship between autism and vaccinations? Personally, I doubt it.
Can I ask about this? I think just said that it would be unethical to do a study.
It would be
because you would have to randomize people and therefore require some people not to have vaccinations.
No, actually, the randomization in the small n trial would be okay. It's if you have a large group, if you're saying to the whole population, we're not going to vaccinate, then the concern is about what happens to the herd immunity of the entire population. That's why it's hard methodologically to do that. If you had people that agreed, 20 people or 100 people agreed to vaccinate and 100 people agreed not to vaccinate, and you compare those two groups, I think that's ethically sound.
Would you briefly explain the concept of herd immunity? Why would vaccinated people be more at risk if some people are unvaccinated, if they have been vaccinated?
So the way it works in terms of these conditions is that the virus has to actually infect individuals and then travel from one infected individual to another. And that's how the virus perpetuates and continues to live. So when everyone's vaccinated against smallpox, then there won't be any more smallpox. When you have even a small percentage who are not vaccinated, then you have the possibility that someone could actually get the condition. So, for example, in Disneyland, there were a few people that weren't vaccinated, got measles, and then were able to infect other people, and it was actually...
Who had been vaccinated.
Who hadn't been vaccinated either. And so then you have this passed on to a population, and it can travel all the way to Quebec. So these are, again, people will say, well, measles is a benign condition, but I would say that all of these in general are much more serious than one meets the eye, and that these, for certain individuals, can have devastating consequences.
Larry,
Mumps itself can cause sterility, can cause all kinds of other conditions that are terrible.
do you want to take up the herd immunity issue?
Yes, one way to take up the herd immunity issue is to refer to Dr. Gregory Poland. Dr. Poland is the head of the Mayo Clinic's vaccine research group. This is one of the world's largest, and maybe the world's largest vaccine research groups. It publishes more than just about anyone. Dr. Poland not only is the head of this, he also works for the pharmaceutical industry. He also is associated with the Centers for Disease Control. So his credentials are as establishment as you can get. What he says is that the MMR vaccine is a failure. It needs to be replaced. He says it cannot prevent herd immunity. In fact, he says that you're likelier to get a measles outbreak in a fully vaccinated population than in an unvaccinated population. So
That's not the general consensus of scientists throughout the world. Full stop.
Herd immunity,
that's fair.
when the concept of herd immunity first came about many decades ago, it was thought that you would need 50% of the population vaccinated to acquire it. Then when that didn't work, they thought, okay, it's 60%. Then it was 65. Then it went up to 80, then 85. These are studies, one study after another, saying, okay, we needs to be a bit higher. Then it went to be 90%, then 95, then 100. And the a Canadian agency said actually it has to be more than 100%. So it's going to be very hard to exceed 100% vaccination to acquire herd immunity. But the other thing that's so interesting is about MMR is the myth that it has done a lot to save lives. You know, a century ago, in 1900, measles killed millions of people, literally millions of people. And then over time, the rate dropped, and it dropped. And by the 60s, 98% of those measles deaths in the US were eliminated. In the UK, by the 60s, 99.96%, virtually all the measles deaths were eliminated by 1963. So you have this huge drop in measles deaths to 1963. 1963 is when the measles vaccine was first introduced. So in other words, after all the deaths were eliminated, that's when the measles vaccine was introduced, and people now say, look, the vaccine has eliminated measles deaths. Well, it had nothing to do with the vast majority of those measles deaths. Not only that, but the measles vaccine creates lots of problems, because in the past, it was considered benign. If you look at the pediatric journals in the 50s and 60s, they described measles as benign, and in fact, it was common. You wanted measles to get the measles because then you had lifetime immunity. And once you had lifetime immunity, you were set. So we used to have measles parties. What happened when the vaccine came in, and Canadian scientists predicted this would happen, the measles would be inflicted on us, on our population, not as children, but as adults. And when you get measles as an adult, then it is serious. So you have a large percentage of like now it's something between a quarter and a half of all measles cases are in adults. And when adults get it, there's a high incidence of pneumonia, something like 50%, and something like a 25% incidence of people needing hospitalization. So you end up, the measles vaccine has transferred measles from a benign situation where children got it safely to where adults are getting it unsafely. It's also a great threat to fetuses, because when expectant mothers have children, they're no longer, if they haven't had measles, they no longer are able to pass antibodies on to their newborns, and that makes their newborns very vulnerable, because in the first year you can't get a shot, an MMR shot. So in that first year, the babies become much more vulnerable, and the amount of antibodies that are passed on, even if the mother is vaccinated, the amount of antibodies that is passed on is only a quarter of the antibodies that would be passed on to the newborn compared to had the mother acquired measles naturally. So it endangers babies, it endangers adults, and all we've done is eliminate a benign disease.
I'm not going to even respond because, again, I would like to know if you have vaccinated your children. Do you have children?
I have children, but I don't see why it's necessary to get personal. I am not opposed to vaccination, but I am opposed to forced vaccination, and I'm opposed to vaccinating anyone who is not informed of the risks. There clearly are so many risks associated with so many vaccines, and I think we have to distinguish between vaccines that prevent very serious harm, such as the polio vaccine. I mean, for the polio vaccine, it's worth taking whatever little risk there is in the vaccine to prevent something as horrific as polio. But to take a risk to prevent something as benign as measles makes no sense to me. To take a vaccine to prevent chickenpox, which is even more benign than measles, has created great harm because the chickenpox, because we're now vaccinating for chickenpox, we have created an epidemic of shingles. Shingles was not a problem before. Now 1/3 of adults are going to get shingles, and this is a very painful disease. And if you've hit 50 or 60, your chance of getting shingles rises to 50 or 60%. So we've eliminated a non-problem, and we've created a major problem. Some vaccines make sense, some vaccines don't.
I think you have to think about the vaccine for the whole population. And again, for some people, chicken pox in a child can actually lead to serious morbidity, serious problems. Same thing with measles, same things with mumps, and same things with rubella. And to sort of trivialize it and to say that these conditions are benign, they're generally well tolerated, overgeneralizes that there are many cases, in fact, where that's not the case. And that's the rationale for having vaccinations in general. And that's the decision of medical experts who treat these conditions, pediatricians, and from my perspective, I have faith in the science of the experts like pediatricians, et cetera. Now, again, I think that you have to look at the epidemiology, you have to do studies. There are no good studies that show that MMR vaccines cause autism.
Let me give you one. It's on the website of the Centers for Disease Control. It was a major study done, came out around 2004, and because it showed no problems with the MMR vaccine, it was a study done of children in the Atlanta area, Atlanta, Georgia. And it was an influential study, and it led to various decisions being made by the medical authorities promoting the idea that vaccines were fine. The study was done by a senior scientist, several people at the Centers for Disease Control, including one person called William Thompson, who's a senior scientist with the CDC, one of their very top scientists. What Thompson, just a year or two ago, went public. He became a whistleblower because he couldn't live with himself anymore, because what the CDC had done was it suppressed data that showed that black children in the Atlanta area had a much higher incidence of autism. And because he was so guilt-racked by it, he actually went public. It led to a big brouhaha. He's seeking whistleblower protection. It may be that he gets to testify about this soon, but he is on tape with his explanation that he has been guilt-racked all these years because all these children, he feels now have suffered autism because he didn't blow the whistle 10 years ago. Now, he's also concerned about being sued because all the parents of these children now may have a claim against him. So this is part of what he's negotiating for now. But the study that's on the CDC website has been, in effect, repudiated by one of the scientists who performed that study. That scientist at the time, he tried to persuade his colleagues to reveal the truth. He made many efforts, and they told him to shut up. And he did shut up, but he felt guilty. Now, there's another major study on the CDC website. It's cited everywhere. It's of the Danish population. That study, it was one of the ones critiqued by Walter Spitzer. He was called before the US Congress to ask about this study, because this study showed that vaccines do not cause autism. And it was considered a very reliable study because it looked at the entire Danish population. And Spitzer was called because he had done quite a similar study for the entire Saskatchewan population, so he was familiar with the methodology, and also he was a top expert in that field. And he explained that the study was actually done extremely well. This is the Danish study on the CDC website. It was done extremely well, and he went through all the steps that were taken. And then he said, but they didn't make the last step. And the last step had, for some reason that he said was totally inexplicable, would have been determinative. It would have shown whether there was a real problem or not. And he said, as it is, the only inference he can draw is that that study, hid at least 50,000 autism cases in the United States and maybe 100 autism cases because of the way the statistics were manipulated. So 2 of the 4 major studies on the CDC site have questions about them. One, we don't know why the last step wasn't taken. Maybe that last step should be taken. That would allay a lot of concerns if that last step was taken. And the other one is this whistleblower accurate in saying that the data is suppressed? He has the data. Maybe we should look at that data. We cannot always assume that governments act with integrity.
Well, I can see that the audience very much believes in what you're saying, and that's a concern for me because the belief that pertussis causes SIDS, hepatitis B causes demyelinating disease, MMR causes autism, thimerosal causes autism, herpes virus vaccine lowers sexual debut, causes more sexually active individuals. Multiple vaccines are a cause of cancer, diabetes, multiple sclerosis. Natural infection is better than immunization. These are all completely not based on fact, and yet people continue to believe them. And so this is what, again, science is up against, is the ability to kind of conduct research and then disseminate that information so that the audience can understand it, the public can understand it. But all of these things are not based in fact.
Eric, you referred to the HPV vaccine among others. One of the scientists who points to a problem, her name is Diane Harper. She was the lead investigator producing that vaccine for both Merck and SmithKline Glaxo. So she is the expert in that field. And what she says is this vaccine makes sense in the third world where women don't have access to the pap smear, but it makes no sense in North America where women do have access.
I'm not arguing about the sensibility, but the idea that it could cause damage, I think is again based on a kind of right-wing perspective on sexuality. That's the kind of the attitude about the
look. She is the one who did the research. She was the one it was her research that led to the vaccines being put on the market. And she says it does damage, it will harm, it will kill some girls, it will damage girls. And this is by the scientists who actually produced the research that led to the marketing of these vaccines. And she thinks there are applications for it where it will save lives, and there are applications for it where it will cost lives and do damage. And we are not distinguishing between the safe applications and the harmful applications.
What's the damage that it will do? What's the mechanism for the damage?
Well, I don't know what the mechanism is, but a lot of these girls are damaged and are no longer able to perform normally.
That's not based on science, what you're saying.
Well, he's citing, to be fair, he's citing an authority and you're not. So I don't know what you mean by science exactly.
Well,
but he's given his source, and you're saying that's not science.
Well, again, my reading of the literature is that there's no evidence that these vaccines are unsafe. If it was unsafe, I would want to know the mechanism for how they're unsafe. Now, if the concern is that it would lead to increased sexual activity, then that's a hypothesis that you would then have to evaluate through an empirical approach.
I haven't heard her raise that concern.
Let me jump in here, because I think it's almost time to open the floor, but there's one more question, which is to do with the vaccine lobby itself. Vaccines are very big business. I'm sure you won't disagree with that. Are they having a role in the debate, in your opinion? Is the vested interest here significant?
Again, my reading of the literature is that, again, these are things that have done good for civilization in terms of protecting us against disease, that they do more good than harm, and that we have oversight through evaluation and constant testing. And you know, that is the approach that we use in healthcare. And you know, that's like arguing that the pharmaceutical industry has a vested interest in many things, and so therefore we shouldn't take medications because, again, there's a vested interest. Now, can data be distorted? Yes. Do we have to be careful about taking at face value a study that's done by the pharmaceutical industry? Yes. Do we have to have kind of arm's length kind of ways of evaluating the research so that it actually is conducted by researchers who aren't necessarily directly funded by the pharmaceutical industry? Do we have to have independent, peer-reviewed research? Absolutely. Do we have to distrust research that's conducted only by the pharmaceutical industry? Yes. We have to evaluate. We have to. You know, we have
Did
to
the
test
manufacturers of OxyContin stampede the medical community or not?
Did they stampede it?
Yeah, this is something you can now say in the newspaper.
Yes.
They did.
Yeah.
So it can happen.
Absolutely.
Okay. Larry, do you want to comment?
Well, certainly money is a very big factor. This is a huge industry. But ironically, initially it wasn't the pharmaceutical industry that was pushing vaccines. And in the 1980s, the major manufacturers decided to get out of vaccines because they weren't making money on it. It accounted for only something like 1% of their revenue, and they were losing money on it because they were continually being sued because of damage that the vaccines were doing. So they started to get out. But it was the government that didn't want them to leave because the government had seen the effectiveness of polio, and they thought they had a magic bullet in vaccines, and that would help them save healthcare costs. So the government went to the vaccine industry and said, look, we know you're losing money. We know that the public doesn't want to take the vaccines. We know that you have a problem with all these lawsuits. Here's what we'll do. We'll eliminate liability for you. We'll prevent anybody from suing you if there's a problem with vaccine. But we'll do more than that. We'll also mandate vaccines. We'll make it mandatory that everyone take vaccines, so now you have a guaranteed market. You don't have to worry about selling it. You don't have to worry about people being reluctant to take vaccines. They'll be forced to. And more than that, we will do the marketing for you. We will buy the vaccines from you, and we will distribute it. So you don't even have to market the vaccines. So the pharmaceutical industry said, well, what do we have to lose? We can't be sued. We have a guaranteed market, and we don't have to go through any effort. So they agreed to that. That's the regime that was put in place. And as a result, the vaccine industry, which was a money loser, is now the most profitable segment of the pharmaceutical industry. It's the fastest growing segment of the pharmaceutical industry. It's the one where the most lobbyists are, because what the industry wants is to force more mandates on more and more vaccines so that everyone gets vaccinated for everything, because then they have more guaranteed profits. You can't blame the pharmaceutical industry for this, but you can say that the incentives that were set up, where they're not liable for any damage that they do, they're completely absolved of any kind of responsibility, that created a perverse situation that led to an unaccountable medical regime.
Let's let Ari respond to that. And can I just add a question on top of it?
Sure.
Is it your view that people should be free in relation to this decision, given what you've said about herd immunity? But I don't want to stop you from addressing what he's just said.
I think that people should be free, and obviously are free to make personal decisions about their health care. They're free to have abortions. They're free to vaccinate or not vaccinate. So I don't think that we can force people to vaccinate. I think it's misinformed not to vaccinate for most conditions. You know, that's my concern. And you know, from my perspective, the damage that we do by misinforming the public that there's this kind of conspiracy, there's this kind of industrial complex, that, you know, it's all about a conspiracy, is very, very problematic, and it kind of plays on people's paranoia about big government, and leads to situations where people then will not vaccinate, will have outbreaks of different diseases, and it won't be based on anything that's scientific. It will, and you know, and people will be harmed, and little children will be harmed. You know, parents have a right, I suppose, to not treat their children when they're infected and have a high fever with antibiotics, and sometimes those children die. And to me, that's tragic when people have a belief of a kind of alternative medicine to treat their children, and they don't use evidence-based medicine, and then there's a bad outcome. So from my perspective, there's freedom, but then people have to also recognize the risks and the accountability that goes with that.
Larry, are you ready to open the floor up? Yep. Okay. This has been a persistent hand here. We got a mic here for you.
So I have a comment and a question. And my comment is that I came here really with an open mind, wanting to hear the pro-vaccine argument outside of an isolation, where I usually only see them on blogs or in individual discussions. And I was quite disappointed because I found that, I'm sorry, I don't know your, Lawrence, I don't know your last name. But he was citing studies talking about historical epidemiological data, talking about, referring to specific stories and doctors. And all you did, Dr. Ari, was dismiss, use words like conspiracy, not scientific, and you never cited any specific studies. You never cited any actual arguments that could contradict what Lawrence was saying, and I never got any actual substance or facts. I'm also wondering, I came here thinking I was going to hear a discussion on Andrew Wakefield's research. I can't say that from the discussion here I would be clear on what the research actually was, what the results were, and why they were questioned. And if you could talk to that as to what the actual study was, and if you have read it. Thank you.
Okay.
So the Wakefield study was a study that was done by a pediatric gastroenterologist who was interested in the effect of the MMR vaccine on the immune system in the gut. And his belief was that when young children are exposed to this vaccine, it alters their immune system in such a way that certain antigens pass through from the intestine into this, into the bloodstream and ultimately into the brain, and lead to some type of autoimmune reaction that then damages the brain. So that's the theory behind Wakefield's study. He had this interest in a leaky gut, and the fact that he observed in a few cases of children with autism that they had different types of GI symptoms, diarrhea, for example, and so on. Not recognizing, of course, that there are more parsimonious ways to explain the fact that there are lots of GI symptoms with kids with developmental disability and autism, like their diet being very morbid and abnormal, actually. So again, these kinds of ideas are interesting, but they have not been replicated. So this idea that there's some immune abnormality in autism, study after study has been done, and they're not replicated. And again, it's important to recognize this was a handful of patients that he observed, and this is becoming used as a kind of raison d'etre that MMR vaccines are dangerous. And again, you need to have lots of well-conducted research studies, ideally randomized controlled trials that would look at this in a larger population. And again, we don't have those studies to suggest that.
The study, it was a very small sample, as Ari said, but there shouldn't be an implication that there's anything improper about that. That study went through all the vetting procedures, and it found something unusual. Walker-Smith thought it was a new syndrome which had been discovered. All that they asked for, they said, look, there's something unusual going on here. We need more research. They did not say that the vaccines cause MMR vaccines cause autism. They simply said, based on what this study shows, there's reason to do more research. That's what the great criticism was about.
Yeah, I have, sorry. Do you want me to take a question here?
Yes,
I just
please.
wanted to mention that just what Larry had talked about 1986, it was Ronald Reagan that granted immunity to the pharmaceutical companies. But what that has led to today is what's called the NVIC, or the NIVC, the National Injury Vaccine Compensation Program. It's under the Health and Human Resources Services Administration in the United States. And in the last 3 years, is this microphone on? Can you hear me?
Yeah, you're fine.
Sorry. Okay. They've awarded $3 billion of damages due to vaccine injury. You can go online. I've looked at all the cases. A lot of them are Guillain-Barré syndrome as a result of the flu vaccine. There's the well-known Hannah Poling case that was reported on CNN by Larry King just in 2010. And Hannah Poling, the family, was awarded $1.5 million for autism, a vaccine injury. You can go on YouTube. You can see the film. You can see the clip. So what is that telling you? It's not an injury compensation program for taking vitamin C. There's a genuine risk in vaccine. They've acknowledged this. The information is out there. I'm not making it up. So the thing is that there should be a vaccine that's 100% safe, or is safe that there is no need for a vaccine injury compensation program if they made it that safe. If the proper research went into making it safe. Right? There wouldn't be these injuries. You can go online. You can look. It's a special master that awards this under the government agency of the United States. And in Canada, we don't have a vaccine injury compensation program, from what I understand. There's just one in Quebec that's loosely administered. It was talked about in the Canadian Medical Association here in Canada, whether there should be a program. So that's all I'm saying. If you're doubting whether vaccine causes injury, just Google HRSA, Human Resources Services Administration. I've gone to their website. It's in the United States. They administer the Vaccine Injury Compensation Program. Families that have felt they've been injured by vaccine apply for compensation. And again, there's a well-known case, the Hannah Poling case. You just can Google this. Larry King's interviewing her and the parents. So that tells you a lot. It tells you a lot that vaccines do carry risk. And that's a problem. I mean, I'm just saying, look, I'm not saying I'm anti-vaccine. There should be pro-vaccine, but they got to understand, why is this happening? It can't be sloppy science.
May you respond? Thank you.
So your point is well taken. Vaccines carry risk. Everything that is a chemical carries risk. All drugs carry risk. Aspirin carries risk. People die to death all the time from taking aspirin.
It's not a vaccine injury compensation program
Right,
for
right.
aspirins.
And you're right. Influenza vaccine can cause Guillain-Barré syndrome. It's a rare outcome. Influenza vaccine can also protect thousands and thousands of deaths in individuals who are immunocompromised and elderly people. So it's a risk-benefit analysis that you have to do. I'm not suggesting that vaccines are perfect, that they carry no risk. What I'm suggesting is this idea that vaccines like MMR cause autism are not based on evidence, on good scientific evidence, and they can and believing that can cause a lot of damage to the public. So that's what I'm trying to convey. Can some vaccines sometimes lead to bad reactions where there is damage to the brain? Absolutely, it can occur very, very rarely. But people believe right now, if you look at the population in the United States, the degree of belief that vaccines are unsafe, that the MMR vaccine is unsafe, and that it's a cause of autism is actually surprisingly high. 30% can believe that. That to me is very concerning, given...
The most severe cases are reported, like in the VICP, but other cases that may be an adverse vaccine reaction may manifest themselves as maybe a milder condition of ASD. And it just goes unreported and unaccountable when they don't draw two and two together. But what I'm saying is that the forensic intervention has to happen to find out what's going on.
So if we're basing our data on what's been reported, we have to multiply that a significant amount. And those are FDA
You can multiply it. You can multiply it. It won't account for the increase in autism that we've seen, and the fact that
How do you know? Do you know what the rate is?
if you look at, well, if you talk about 1 in 64, 2% of the population, that kind of thing, have autism spectrum disorder, it doesn't bear the science to say that vaccines, which have been used for decades, many decades, are the cause temporally of this increase in autism. We would have expected to see an increase in autism since the 1960s. And what we've seen is a takeoff in the rate of autism diagnosis since 2000.
We've also seen an increase in the number of vaccinations and combinations.
Question for,
Yes.
It's not the measles vaccine that's been implicated. It's not the measles vaccine that was implicated. It was the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine. That came about 20 years ago. The measles vaccine, in fact, Wakefield suggested that people be vaccinated with the measles vaccine, but they might be hesitant about the MMR vaccine. The measles vaccine was still on the market when he suggested that it be used by parents. But the government did not like that idea because it was less expensive for them to use the MMR vaccine than the measles vaccine. So they removed the measles vaccine from use in order to encourage use of the MMR vaccine.
I'll try to try to keep my question quick. Most perplexing thing to me about this subject is when I hear physicians or other medical professions say that it would be unethical to have a random control research study with vaccinated families and unvaccinated families, that they could never ask families to not vaccinate so as to participate in the study. That is complete bunk because there are hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of families in North America alone that do not vaccinate their kids. It'd be easy to compare the two population groups. Dr. Ari, I was just wondering how you would how you think about that.
No, actually, I agree with you. I think in a small n kind of way, you could actually do that, and I don't think that it would be unethical. I think if people freely choose to not vaccinate, then you could try to compare those groups that have not vaccinated. My concern is to misinform the entire population that vaccines are dangerous and cause a situation where lots of people are deliberately not vaccinating because of their fear about vaccines. I think we have to make decisions based on the evidence. The evidence right now suggests that vaccines are relatively safe, do more good than harm.
Just follow up thing about that. You so many times this evening you mentioned about science and doing the research, but yet on this one, on the idea of comparing vaccinated with unvaccinated families, you balk. It's as though it's out of the question. It can't be done. It's really perplexing.
I'm not suggesting that it can't be done. I'm agreeing with you. I think it can be done. My concern is about misinforming the entire population to not vaccinate. I think that could be a dangerous thing. But I think that if people freely choose to not vaccinate and we can conduct research that would compare the outcome of those children compared to those that have been vaccinated, I think that would be very useful research.
But yet it's never been done and continues to be.
It's been done. It's been done. I want to say a few things. I'll introduce myself. My name is Kinjal, and I have a PhD in genetics. I have a lot of things to say.
Sound.
My name is Kinjal. I have a PhD in genetics, and I just wanted to make a few points about this discussion. The first thing that you mentioned is about the Wakefield study. I agree there are some ethical issues around it which may have been removed, but to me, I read the paper. The primary problem with that study was that the group used 8 cases where they looked at their gastrointestinal leaks. They found some leaks in 8 children that had been vaccinated with the MMR vaccine. But they did not look at anyone that had not been vaccinated. I'm a scientist, and today if I tried to publish that kind of study, it would be thrown in the garbage. If you cannot compare it with anything, then you can't say that they have more problems than people that have been unvaccinated. There was another study in Finland. I have a lot of studies, if we want to discuss later. It was by a group called Peltola et al., where they looked at a couple of hundred vaccinated children. They looked at their intestines. They found 31 to have perforations in their intestines. None of them got autism later on. Some other points. I'm a cancer researcher, so I'm not, I don't know too much about vaccines, but I can imagine that 30 years in the future, there'll be a group like this discussing cancer vaccines, and people will say, is the government trying to sell us cancer vaccines? Is this all a hoax? Is it a way to make money? But in my field, we work very hard, and we have a problem. People are dying of cancer. 1 in 2 Canadians is going to be diagnosed with cancer in their lifetime. And researchers are not making money. Researchers are trying to figure out what can we do to solve this present social problem. And I imagine that was the situation when people died of measles, like in the 50s and 60s, before the vaccine was invented. After that, there was a huge decrease in the number of people that died from measles, which is why this was promoted. Some other things. You raised, one of the questions that was raised was a population study that we call it in genetics is a population study where you compare a treated group with a control group, so the vaccinated versus the unvaccinated. These have been done many, many times, and there's one really nice study that came out of Italy that compiled 64 such studies where they took reports of children, 14.7 million in total. They compiled the data comparing vaccinated children with the MMR versus individual vaccinations, no vaccinations, and placebo, which means that you give them something and make them think that they've been vaccinated, which is now unethical. And they found that there are risks associated with meningitis, seizures, and something called thrombocytopenic purpura, which I don't know what that is. But, thank you. But there's no association. This is 14.7 million people, and I'll tell you, if you use 1,000 people, you can find associated risk for breast cancer, which is my thesis. They did not find any association with autism. And I'll just explain how a population study works. You take a number of people in a certain group, let's say a vaccinated group, and then you take a number of people that are matched with in age and sex and whatever, and in the unvaccinated group, and then you ask, is there an increased risk of getting autism in one group compared to the other group? And this what these people found, and they didn't do the study. They compiled studies from across the world. They didn't find any increased risk to autism, asthma, leukemia, hay fever, and there's like a number of other type 1 diabetes and all of these other things that they assessed. I'm sorry, I know you have a question, but I just have a few more points to make. Wakefield also raised the concern by his study that autism is caused by gastrointestinal breaches. A lot of studies have been done consequently, including the one that I just cited from Finland, that show that this is not true. There is no so they talked about like peptides affecting the brain that would be breached from the intestine, that would cross the blood-brain barrier, enter the brain and cause some kind of inflammation. Autistic children's brains have been studied, and these peptides have not been found in their brain. And in fact, there's a lot of genetic studies influenced by the environment that show that endogenous proteins that affect neuronal connections, regulation of the neurons, and cell-cell adhesion in the brain that actually cause autism or are shown to have a positive association or a risk related to autism. This study that assessed the 15 million or 14.7 million children that I told you about also assessed the efficacy of the MMR vaccine in preventing an outbreak of measles and mumps in these children. It was 95% efficacious, pardon my pronunciation, in preventing a measles outbreak if you gave them this vaccine, compared to if you're exposed to a person with measles without being vaccinated, you have a 90% chance of picking up this vaccine, picking up the illness, and there are cases of death and brain inflammation. Okay, all right. All right.
More eloquently than me made the point that I've tried to make earlier, which is the epidemiologists that have been doing studies on this, looking at large sample sizes, have not found a signal associated with the MMR vaccine and autism. So we haven't done the randomized controlled trial, but we have done studies that looked at thousands and thousands of individuals, both those that have been exposed to the vaccine, those that haven't, and when you compare the two, you don't see an increased risk of autism in those that have been exposed. That's how you do studies that can lead to policy change. And this is what my concern is that you're hearing this, and yet there's people in the audience that are, don't confuse me with the facts, there's a risk here. And that's my concern, is that it doesn't change the hearts and minds of people. The science doesn't change the hearts and minds, and it should. It really should.
Well, with all due respect, people have found those problems. Walter Spitzer has found those signals. For that reason, he thinks there's a high likelihood of the MMR vaccine being a risk factor with autism. But there's a theme here, which Kinjal, you raised, and Ari, I think, is implicit with you. And the theme is that people are somehow unthinking, that they're going to be stampeded into rejecting vaccines that work because of some kind of zeitgeist out there. People.
Irrational and emotional.
Dr. Healey addressed this. She was the head of the National Institutes of Health. She said we can trust the public. They understand there's a difference between polio and measles. We can do the research. And she was addressing the fact that the mindset among government researchers was, if we admit we need research, people are going to avoid getting vaccinated and there are going to be more deaths. So let's not admit we need any research. Let's pretend we don't need any research. Let's pretend the science is settled because the public is dumb. We can't trust the public to make decisions on their own. I think, Gregory Poland, he's the one at the Mayo Institute. He's the one who says the MMR vaccine doesn't work, and if you fully vaccinate the public, you're going to end up with more measles outbreaks. He is working he criticizes the idea of one-size-fits-all vaccines. He thinks vaccines should be based on one's own genome, and that's a branch of science that he's starting, genomics. And that, I don't think anybody who has cancer is going to say, I'm not going to take this vaccine that's designed for me to cure my cancer. I don't think you're going to find anybody who's not willing to take that vaccine. So the notion that people can't think for themselves, can't make decisions, and the notion that we need governments or others telling us what we must take is, I think, a very questionable thesis, and one that we should ask about. It says a lot about how we view our fellow citizens.
There's somebody here, I think.
Yeah. I'm not good with mics, and is it working?
Yeah, okay. You're all right. Keep it close to your mouth.
Sorry?
Keep it close to your mouth, that's
okay. I don't know if the doctor is aware of this handout. I have a handout here that lists 46 doctors. The head of it says, so you want to hear it from a doctor. Doctors explain clearly why vaccines are not safe. There are lots of doctors questioning vaccines. And what I've done personally is I've made a list of some quotes from doctors that I put on the back of this. I'm going to actually offer you this kit, Doctor. I can't remember your last name.
Zaretsky.
Okay, before you leave, what I did was I made up 30 of these kits, and I left them for all the doctors in the medical practice in Port Perry. That's where I had my babies too many years ago and didn't know anything about vaccines, and I've learned a lot in the last year. So I've handed these kits to the doctors in Port Perry. I'm going to offer you one. I put a whole bunch of stuff in it with a graphic about measles, and there's this graphic about doctors, and I want to read a quote here I hope you'll read them all because the quotes are amazing and they are from MDs, as I say. Dr. Rachel Ross says, they don't teach us about the ingredients, they don't teach us about the studies behind it. What they teach us is that they've always been given. I've heard doctor after doctor now admit that they're really not taught about vaccines in medical school. It's just an article of faith. It's like a religion. Vaccines are good, use them. So I don't know if you're aware of that. And I also don't know if you're aware of this study by Neil Miller, combining childhood vaccines is not safe. We parents now know that the vaccines are combined like crazy. I have a young grandchild who is probably going to get just a wicked whack of vaccine in a little while. There's like about 8 of them, I think. The inserts, people need to read the inserts. Have you read the inserts of the vaccines? They're terrifying. So they're going to give my granddaughter like 8 vaccines at once. In order to get the inserts, my daughter would have to, well, I got the inserts. I went to my own doctor in Port Perry and got the inserts. And frankly, I'm terrified to look at them because I've already looked at the inserts for MMR vaccine and so on. Those inserts are terrifying. And I'd like to know why doctors don't hand those out proactively. Except that I know why they don't hand them out, because they don't want patients to know that stuff. Anyway, so there's an article here, combining childhood vaccines at one visit is not safe. And it was in the Journal of American Physicians and Surgeons in the summer of 2016. So I'll give you a copy of this in the kit. I think there's just a whole lot doctors don't know, and it's being busted wide open at this point, and I hope doctors will start paying attention. I guess I don't have a question.
Thank you. Thank you. Ari, do you want to answer her?
Doctors don't know everything, and you know, obviously, as I said, everything has a risk. Vaccines have a risk. People can have seizures from taking vaccines. People can have adverse reactions from having vaccines. It's a risk-benefit analysis. And when you think about the whole population, again, you have to look at the epidemiology and look at the benefits versus the risks. Many of the adverse reactions that are serious are very rare reactions, whereas the illnesses themselves are actually, if you're not immune, then they're very serious. Whether you get pneumonia, whether you get meningitis, those kinds of conditions are very serious. And so I'm surprised that people view these kinds of issues and laugh at this, because I think it's really serious. These are serious, serious illnesses that can damage individuals. Even something as simple as mumps can cause an individual, and this is like there's a serious risk of this, of causing something like sterility. Those are not trivial things. They're serious, serious conditions that a person is exposed to.
Okay, maybe one more, and then we're going to wrap it up, and we can carry it on.
If it doesn't work, it doesn't matter.
All right, 2 more.
In 1990, I had the distinct pleasure of getting cerebral malaria. You kill it with quinine, or it kills you. My dear wife nursed me afterwards, and here I am today to tell the tale. I recently read Nicholas Wade's book, A Troublesome Inheritance. Nicholas Wade is the genetics journalist for the New York Times. And he basically points out that the former so-called prejudice of anthropologists that the world is divided into 5 races is genetically probably true. And as a result of that, one of the things I picked up from the book is that sub-Saharan Africans don't succumb to cerebral malaria like white North Americans like myself do. So underneath the entire debate tonight, with respect, there seems to be an implicit Enlightenment assumption that all humans are biologically the same. So my question to both of you, is it possible that all forms of medical interventions, such as vaccinations, may have differential results in various parts of the world? Differential in sub-Saharan Africa, differential in Asia, differential in European America, and differential in Austronesia. I haven't, in my mild reading of the literature, come across that, but as Larry pointed out, that the genome is not universal, and our alleles are statistically distinguished from each other according to massive geographical groupings. So The underlying gestalt of this argument is that, well, if it's true for this group in the United Kingdom, it must be true for people in sub-Saharan Africa. I have me doubts, as the Scots would say. Thank you.
Before the answers come, mightn't your question also apply with changes to variation within populations?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's another dimension. Sure.
Yeah. Okay. Well, who's first? Mary?
Well, I would agree. Yeah. This is what the Mayo Institute is pursuing, that exact course of logic.
It's possible. Yeah, it's possible. But again, what I would prefer us to focus on is, for our North American population right now, what does the epidemiology say about the relationship between the MMR vaccine and autism?
You got it? You got the mic? You do.
Is it working?
Yeah.
Yeah, good. So there are so many things, so many places, possible places to start. I guess there's a few things, I guess, that I would just like to question. This idea that everything has a risk. I think Ari actually was just talking about this, and that in modern medicine we talk about weighing the benefits with the risks, and I think that's actually not bad advice. And I think in this case that also means then acknowledging that childhood illnesses are not risky, and actually that the side effects are very rare. I think the worst. I don't really see pneumonia as a bad side effect. In fact, because pneumonia is incredibly treatable today in modern medicine. And I think the one serious side effect is brain swelling, so encephalitis, and that I think that the chances of getting that are incredibly minute. I knew at one point, I can't remember right now. So that's one point. The other point is that Ari kept referring to the fact that we need to talk about cause and effect. And in fact, that's in sort of what this whole discussion tonight has talked about, whether it is, whether we can blame the MMR vaccine for causing autism. However, Ari also talked about, that we need to look at genetic versus epigenetic factors. And I think in that wider context, we would see, so if we did this study, as you were both proposing, looking at unvaccinated versus vaccinated children, for example, to look at the health outcomes, I don't even think, and you both said that would be a conclusive study. I actually don't think it would, because of this idea of epigenetics, and that is this idea that accumulative effects. So the MMR vaccine is just one toxin among many that we are exposed to in childhood, many being all the toxins in our environment now, in our vaccines, in our food supply, in our air. So that's one point. And then I also think that there's, in order to have this conversation in any kind of successful way, or to move it forward, we need to actually have a concept of health. And right now, that is actually severely lacking in medicine. And if we did, we would see that actually, health is a state of becoming. We are not either healthy or sick. We don't either have a disease. Actually, let's not go there. We're not either healthy or sick. This idea that you actually need to have illnesses to actually, basically the whole idea of the immune system is that you need to have an illness, go through an illness, learn something from the illness, become resistant to it, and the immune system has gone through new learning and is in a better spot, or has kind of mastered new skills, you could say. And that's, in fact, the opportunity that is lost when we eradicate the childhood illnesses, or the opportunity, in fact, to experience any kind of a disease today.
the group in the audience. I actually agree with you in part. I actually believe that, for example, the reason why asthma has increased enormously in the last little while is related to the fact that we are tampering with the immune systems of our children, and we're not exposing them to the right type of immune response that will allow them to kind of have a normal immune system. The immune system has to know how to react, and then it has to learn how to shut off. And what we're seeing is that when that's played with abnormally, you can have asthma, you can have autoimmune diseases, and we're seeing an increase in that.
That's what vaccines do as well.
And vaccines might do that. Vaccines also do good things, like they prevent serious illnesses, which I don't think that everyone can acknowledge and recognize that vaccines in general prevent serious illnesses that I think need to be prevented. Now, I also believe that there is a gene-environment interaction. That's my suspicion, is that with autism, maybe there's a diagnostic change that has occurred, and that's the reason. There's certainly genetics at play, but I suspect also that there's something going on in the environment. It's just that I don't feel that the science supports the MMR vaccine as the offender. I don't think that the epidemiology supports that. Does that mean that isn't something else toxic in the environment, pollutants, other things? Well, it's not mercury, because we've been looking at that. And again, this is what I mean. Timber salt is not the cause of autism. The studies have been done, the epidemiology has been done, and it's not that. But it may be something else. It might be something else. I do think that there has been an increase in autism, and some of it's diagnostic, just the way we diagnose it, because there's a spectrum approach. But I also suspect that it's more than that, and I think that we do need to do the research, and we need to be aware of the fact that the immune system is a very complicated thing. So I'm in partial agreement about some of those issues. I think it's important to look at the facts, though, about the MMR vaccine and the epidemiological studies that have been done, that have been eloquently described, and the science doesn't support it.
Do you want to say something, Larry, or you want to let it go on?
Well, I agree with part of what Ari said. I think we're about to wrap up.
Yeah, I hope so, but we've got...
Because I'd like to close on an optimistic note. One thing that we may not realize, we in the Anglosphere, is that there are more people in the world than the English speakers. The English speakers have this notion that vaccines are safe, and the press represses any dissent. In Europe, in Japan, there's actually quite a debate, and the public broadcaster, for example, in Scandinavian countries, have full-length documentaries showing problems with vaccines. It's a big issue in France now. It's a big issue in much of the EU. In fact, next week, I think it's either next week or the week after, Andrew Wakefield is going to be addressing the European Union. So here he's vilified. There his opinion is worthwhile, and I think soon his opinion will also be respected in North America, because it looks like the U.S. is going to have a commission headed by Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who is an environmentalist but very concerned about mercury, very knowledgeable in mercury. He became concerned because he was concerned about mercury being emitted from coal plants, and then he realized that in fact we're ingesting through vaccines far more mercury than we would ever be allowed to ingest from in the atmosphere. So if this commission goes ahead in the United States, I believe it's going to totally wipe out the myth that vaccines are, for the most part, safe.
Okay, did we have one more person? Okay, and then we're going to wrap it up. Please. You got to get it close to your mouth.
Yeah, okay, good. I just wanted to speak up for a generation of people who, I imagine, like me, never had these vaccinations. I had mumps, I had measles, I had chickenpox, and everybody I knew did it. I lived in 3 different places, 3 different countries, and everybody at my age, they just took it for granted that one day they would get those diseases, and they weren't considered serious or anything. In fact, it was a time you could stay in bed, read comic books, and get ginger ale. So it wasn't a big deal. The thing that I think that we all got from that, those of you who were around when I was as a child, is that we're healthy and our immune systems work. And I think that this is I think we were born with immune systems, not just us, animals, everybody, in order to use them. That's what they're there for. So constantly say, oh, it's not good enough, and we tell the body it's not good enough, it's not going to work so well next time. So I really believe that our bodies are telling us the truth, more than big pharma or governments or doctors or anybody. Whoops, but I don't know how to make this work.
I think you've made your point. Do you want to comment, or?
I don't think I will.
Okay.
Nice note to end on.
That's okay. Let's leave it there. Thank you all. We can carry on talking.
Thank you, Harry.
And we'll be back here at the end of February on Tuesday night, discussing God knows what.
I think it's fabulous that we're talking.